Dad went fishing with son but never returned. Then a hunter found their camera. Caleb's entire world revolved around two constants: his quiet small-town life and the annual fishing trip with his father Jonathan. It wasn't just a getaway, not to him. At 13, the trip had taken on a sacred weight. Each year, when the last frost melted and spring stretched its limbs, Caleb began his silent countdown. He scratched tallies into the back of his school binder. He rehearsed the stories they'd tell on the way, the meals they'd cook over the open fire, the stillness of dawn broken only by birdsong and the gentle splashes of fish beneath the surface. For most kids, Christmas was the highlight. For Caleb, it was a weekend in the woods with his dad, fishing rods in hand and no one else in sight. Jonathan wasn't the kind of man who made a fuss. A former park ranger, he had the calm sturdiness of someone who'd seen too much to be shaken easily. Since the death of his wife, Caleb's mother, 5 years ago, he'd carried a quiet weight in his eyes, the kind that never left but learned to sit quietly in the corners. He never spoke of the grief, not directly. He poured his energy into routines, early morning jogs, working maintenance jobs at the local campground, raising his son with steady hands and soft but firm discipline. But the fishing trip was different. It was the one time of year when his voice softened, when the edge in his shoulders eased. It was the one time he allowed himself to stop surviving and just live. That year, Jonathan had chosen a new location, Hollow Creek. The name alone made Caleb's ears perk up. It sounded like something out of one of the ghost stories the older kids at school dared each other to read after dark. Jonathan had found it while going through old ranger maps in the basement, tucked between yellowed pages and faded ink lines. It was a forgotten pocket of wilderness near the border of a long-abandoned national testing zone, one that had quietly been closed off decades ago after funding cuts and political red tape. There were no paved roads leading in, only a single winding dirt path nearly consumed by years of undergrowth. Most locals avoided it. Some said it was haunted. Others said it was just too wild, too unpredictable. Jonathan wasn't one to listen to rumors. He saw it as a challenge, a place pure and untouched, where he could teach Caleb how to read signs in the bark of trees, track movement without a sound, and appreciate the silence that only the deep woods could offer. The week before the trip was a slow build of anticipation. Caleb watched his father with wide eyes as he laid out their gear across the dining table. Jonathan moved with deliberate care, checking each item twice. Fishing lines were unwound and rewound with fresh hooks. The flare gun was tested in the backyard, a single dull pop echoing into the trees. Batteries were swapped in the handheld radio, though Jonathan made a note that they'd likely be out of range. The Nikon camera, an old but sturdy model from the early 2000s, was cleaned, its lens polished until it gleamed. That camera had captured every trip they'd taken since Caleb was 8. It had seen campfires crackle to life, fish held proudly in small, trembling hands, and the soft smiles between father and son as the sun dipped behind the trees. To remember the wild, Jonathan always said, half to himself, half to the wind. On the morning of their departure, the town was still asleep. Fog curled around the sidewalks like breath. Caleb stood at the doorway with his backpack, shoes tapping restlessly against the wood floor, his jacket zipped too high in his excitement. Jonathan moved slower, methodically. He double-checked the locks, left a note with the neighbor, filled the truck's tank, and loaded their gear into the back with the precision of someone packing for more than a weekend. There was always a ritual to leaving. Caleb waited patiently, used to the pace by now. But today he noticed something small, Jonathan pausing longer than usual at the front door, his eyes scanning the treetops in the distance, as if listening for something. He didn't say anything about it, just adjusted the strap on his backpack and followed his father to the truck. The drive took them past familiar roads that slowly dissolved into gravel paths. Cell service disappeared within the first hour, leaving behind the hum of the engine and the occasional chirp of birds overhead. Jonathan didn't speak much, and Caleb didn't press. They passed weather-beaten signs marking long-forgotten trails, their letters faded and unreadable. At one point, they crossed a small wooden bridge that groaned under the weight of the truck. Below it, a stream ran dark and slow, veiled by mist. Caleb leaned out the window, trying to catch a glimpse of the water. It was beautiful in a way that felt untouchable, like something preserved outside of time. As they neared the edge of Hollow Creek, the forest seemed to thicken unnaturally. The trees grew closer together, their trunks wide and bark scarred. Vines twisted like veins along the ground, and every so often, Jonathan would stop the truck, step out, and clear a branch from the road himself. Caleb watched him, noting the way his father's eyes moved, not just scanning, but searching. There was a caution to him today that hadn't been there on previous trips. Not fear exactly, but a quiet alertness, like the woods had changed the rules without telling anyone. Still, he smiled when he got back in the truck each time, said something about the path being wild with age, and they kept moving. By the time they reached the clearing, the sun was beginning its descent, casting long shadows that swayed with the trees. The campsite was small but perfect, just a few feet from a lake so still it looked like glass. A family of ducks drifted silently across the water, barely making ripples. Jonathan parked the truck at the edge and stepped out, breathing deep like he always did on the first day. Caleb did the same, trying to match his father's calm. The air was cooler here, wrapped in the scent of pine, damp earth, and something else, something he couldn't quite place. It was sharp, metallic almost. He wrinkled his nose but said nothing. They spent the evening setting up camp. The tent was old but reliable, popping into place with practiced hands. Jonathan lit a small fire with flint and steel, showing Caleb how to angle the stones and catch the spark. They ate jerky and trail mix, washed it down with warm bottled water, and sat in the firelight without need for words. The Nikon rested beside them, already holding its first photo of the trip, a slightly blurry shot of Caleb climbing over a fallen log. It was tradition to take pictures at every new place, as proof of memory, or maybe just to anchor themselves to something real in a world that changed too fast. Later, as stars broke across the sky and the woods settled into their nocturnal rhythm, Caleb lay inside the tent, wrapped in his sleeping bag, listening to the forest. He loved this part, when the day faded into quiet and the trees whispered secrets only they could hear. But tonight, the silence felt heavier. The usual songs of crickets and frogs seemed thinner, distant. There was a low hum in the background, just on the edge of hearing, like the vibration of something deep underground. He closed his eyes tighter, trying to ignore it, convincing himself it was the wind, or maybe the truck cooling down. Still, sleep came slowly. Outside the tent, Jonathan sat alone by the fire, the camera in his lap, staring into the trees. His jaw was tense, his fingers tapping the body of the Nikon with quiet rhythm. Something about this place unsettled him. He'd spent years in the wild, trained to notice what didn't belong, and there was a wrongness here, subtle but undeniable. He couldn't place it. The silence wasn't natural. The trees leaned slightly inward like they were listening. He told himself it was just his imagination, that he was projecting fear where there was none. But deep down, he felt it. This forest didn't want them here. Still, he didn't wake Caleb, didn't speak the fear aloud. He took one more photo, just the trees under starlight, and set the camera beside him. Then he sat still, watching the fire burn low, waiting for the forest to blink first. They set up camp by the creek just as the sun dipped below the tree line, casting the forest in amber hues and long, soft shadows. The air held a crispness that hinted at the coming fall, and every breath Caleb took felt alive with pine, moss, and the faint scent of smoke curling from their fire pit. Birds chirped in distant harmony, their songs weaving through the rustling canopy above, and the sound of the water slipping over rocks and fallen branches lent a calm rhythm to their temporary home. With their tent staked near the creek's edge and their supplies neatly organized in waterproof bags, it felt like they had carved out a tiny, peaceful world of their own. The first day passed without trouble. Caleb's eyes lit up when he reeled in his first catch, a small trout that flopped wildly before settling into the net. Jonathan showed him how to clean it, his hands steady and practiced as Caleb mimicked his every move, eyes squinting in concentration. They built a modest fire, crackling steadily as dusk gave way to night. Their laughter danced through the trees as Caleb fumbled with marshmallows, and Jonathan teased him about burning everything he touched. Goofy selfies on the old Nikon camera captured their grins. the orange glow of firelight painting their faces with warmth and joy. It was a perfect start, simple and real, grounded in a bond that had grown only deeper over the years. Jonathan used the time to teach, slipping bits of wilderness wisdom into their hours together. He showed Caleb how to identify tracks in the dirt, raccoon, deer, and something he didn't name but simply stared at for a beat too long. They examined leaves and plants, distinguishing those safe to touch or eat from the ones that could blister or sicken. Caleb listened with rapt attention, nodding solemnly, eager to impress and silently proud whenever Jonathan offered a rare, approving nod. As night fell, the woods changed. Insects hummed their quiet lullaby, and the fire became their center of gravity. Beyond the circle of light, the forest grew darker, thicker, as if watching. That night, Caleb noticed his father checking the woods more often than usual. Between stories and firewood runs, Jonathan's eyes kept darting to the trees, scanning in long, silent sweeps. His shoulders remained relaxed, his voice calm, but there was a tightness around his mouth, a flicker of tension behind his gaze. When Caleb finally asked why he kept looking into the dark, Jonathan only muttered something about animals acting strange in this area. It didn't make much sense to Caleb, but the way his father said it, measured, low, almost distracted, left a lingering discomfort. Caleb didn't press. He simply zipped his sleeping bag a little higher and inched closer to the fire until the warmth soothed the unease growing in his chest. The second morning dawned with golden light filtering through dew-laced branches. Birds took up their chorus early, and the creek sparkled like glass as Caleb stirred from sleep. Breakfast was simple. Oatmeal warmed over the fire and the leftover trout, now flaked and crisped in the skillet. Caleb, still waking, groaned dramatically after his first failed attempt to clean another fish, earning a rare chuckle from Jonathan, who leaned over to show him where the spine ran. The moment felt easy again, even normal, until they decided to hike deeper along the forest's edge. It started with the stillness. As they walked further from the campsite, Caleb noticed the forest quieting. The birdsong tapered off. No insects buzzed near their ears. Even the breeze, which had danced through the treetops earlier, seemed to hold its breath. The deeper they went, the more aware Jonathan became of their surroundings. He moved slower, gaze lingering on tree trunks and the forest floor, as if expecting something to step out at any moment. Then they saw the markings. A tree just off the path bore deep slashes, 4 of them, angled down in deliberate strokes, each one nearly equidistant from the next. The bark had splintered around the gashes, exposing pale, fresh wood beneath. Caleb stopped short, uncertain. Jonathan walked closer, running his fingers just above the cuts without touching them. His expression shifted, eyes narrowing, lips pressed together. Caleb asked what might have made them, but Jonathan didn't answer. He only glanced around and said they should head back soon. As they walked on, they found more. Another tree, marked with the same deliberate pattern. Then another. Each set of slashes identical, cut deep, not from claws or weather, but something sharper, metal perhaps. Jonathan stopped talking altogether. He took the lead now, his shoulders rigid, eyes scanning more frequently. The Nikon camera, which had been out all morning to capture wildlife and landscapes, was zipped tightly inside the main pack. Caleb noticed. He also noticed his father's hand brushing the handle of the hunting knife at his belt more often, as though reassuring himself it was still there. Their hike ended earlier than planned. Jonathan claimed it was because the sun would set sooner behind the dense ridge, and they needed to gather more firewood. But even Caleb could tell that wasn't the reason. Back at camp, Jonathan's movements were efficient but tense. He built up the fire higher than before, used more kindling, more fuel, even placed extra logs nearby in a neat stack. Caleb helped silently, feeling the shift. The air had changed. The creek still gurgled, the sky still shone, but the feeling, that tight, pressing sensation in the chest, remained. That night they didn't laugh as much. There were no selfies, no stories. Jonathan remained by the fire, poking at it absently, his gaze frequently drawn beyond the light's reach. Caleb tried to distract himself by flipping through the pictures they'd taken earlier, smiling faintly at the blurry one of his fish mid-jump, but even that couldn't shake the sense that something unseen hovered just out of view. He finally zipped up the camera, mimicking his father, and tucked it deep into the pack. Sleep didn't come easily. Every rustle in the underbrush, every branch snapping in the wind felt amplified in the silence. Caleb lay curled in his sleeping bag, listening to the fire pop and crackle, eyes fixed on the shadows dancing across the tent walls. Outside, Jonathan didn't sleep. He sat near the fire until long past midnight, back straight, posture alert. Once or twice, Caleb saw his silhouette rise and move toward the tree line, only to return minutes later and stoke the fire again. By morning, the unease hadn't faded. Breakfast was silent. The birds still hadn't returned. Caleb watched his father closely now, trying to read him, trying to understand the quiet urgency that had replaced his calm. Jonathan caught his gaze once, tried to smile, but it faltered before it reached his eyes. Caleb wanted to ask if they'd be heading home early. Instead, he said nothing and followed his father toward the creek again, hoping that whatever had changed might simply pass. But the trees ahead held more marks, and this time, they weren't alone. By the third day, the forest no longer felt like a place of peace. The calm that once seemed to hang in the air like morning mist had grown brittle, warped. The birds still sang, the trees still whispered, but underneath it all was something else, an unease so thick it pressed against the skin. Jonathan stopped venturing far from the camp, abandoning their planned hikes and firewood excursions that once carried a sense of adventure. Instead, he stayed close, eyes scanning the tree line like it was a moving threat. He didn't say why. Caleb asked once, maybe twice, but his father's silence said more than words ever could. Jonathan grew tense in a way Caleb had never seen before. He barely slept, taking to pacing the campsite at night with an old hunting knife that had lived at the bottom of a box in their garage for years. Its blade still gleamed, recently sharpened, though it hadn't tasted bark or bone in decades. In one hand he carried his flashlight, in the other, that knife, and he would make slow circles in the dark, each lap just wide enough to skim the edges of their little makeshift refuge. Caleb watched him through the mesh of the tent sometimes, breath held without realizing. Even wrapped in his sleeping bag, he didn't feel warm. During the day, Caleb tried to fill the silence. He cracked jokes the way he always did when things felt off, tossed pine cones at imaginary monsters, narrated their meals like a survival show host. But the jokes landed flat, their echoes dying too quickly. His father's unease had become contagious. It was in the way Jonathan would freeze mid-step when a branch snapped somewhere in the distance, the way his eyes constantly searched the shadows, too alert, like he was expecting something. Caleb started noticing it too. Strange silences that came too suddenly, patches of forest that felt heavier than others. There were no obvious threats, no claw marks or growls in the night. But something was wrong. Deeply wrong. That night, long after the fire had fizzled into glowing coals, a sound stirred them from their separate stillnesses. Distant rustling, faint but deliberate. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a squirrel or deer. It was heavier, paced, like someone moving just beyond the trees, not trying to be quiet, but not fully revealing themselves either. Jonathan tensed in an instant. His back straightened, his breath caught. He whispered toward the tent, a soft, urgent warning for Caleb to stay inside and not move, no matter what. There was no argument in Caleb's body, no instinct to challenge. He obeyed, heart pounding like a drum too fast to keep a rhythm. He lay frozen in his sleeping bag, straining to hear. The rustling continued for another few seconds, then abruptly stopped. A silence followed, unnerving in its precision, like something had paused deliberately. Caleb waited. Then he heard something else, a sound so out of place in his father that it struck harder than any scream. It was soft at first, almost mistaken for the creak of a tree. But then it came again, clearer. His father, crying. Not loudly, but real. A quiet, shaking sob just outside the tent, like the weight of something unbearable had finally broken through. Caleb clenched his jaw and pulled the bag tighter around him, his body refusing to move. Not out of fear of the forest, but fear of what it meant to hear Jonathan cry like that. The following morning, Jonathan looked like he hadn't slept at all. His face was pale, jaw rigid, eyes bloodshot but focused. He moved with a sense of purpose Caleb had only seen once before, when they'd had to evacuate during a wildfire back home. Calm, deliberate, urgent. While stirring the last of the oats, he mentioned they would pack up that night. They would leave before sunrise, before the world was awake. Caleb nodded, the decision ringing final in a way he didn't question. But somewhere inside, a quiet unease whispered that it wouldn't be that simple. As the day dragged on, they moved through the camp like ghosts. No words were needed. Caleb helped roll the sleeping bags, organize the packs, check the food inventory. He watched his father more closely now. Jonathan kept glancing toward the woods, his face hardening each time, like he expected something to step out. When Caleb asked what they were looking for, the question just hung there, unanswered, until it faded into nothing. There was no room for explanations, only preparation. As the sun dipped behind the ridgeline, shadows stretched across the clearing, and the forest darkened quicker than usual. The final hours of daylight always felt thinner, more fragile. Caleb noticed Jonathan had stopped moving. He stood near the edge of camp, not facing him, shoulders rigid. The bag he'd been strapping sat half done at his feet. His gaze was fixed, unmoving, pointed into the thickest part of the woods. Caleb followed it, tried to see what his father saw, but the trees were just trees, dense and dark. Yet there was something about the way Jonathan stood that made Caleb's skin crawl. It wasn't just alertness. It was fear, raw, full-body fear. Not the kind that made you run, but the kind that rooted you in place. Caleb wanted to ask what was out there, but something held his voice in his throat. He just watched. That would be the last time he saw that expression on his father's face. When night fell, the forest swallowed the light quickly. The fire was small, intentionally so, just enough to warm their hands and ward off the dark. Jonathan told Caleb to go to bed early. He said he would finish with the firewood, make sure everything was packed and ready to go before morning. His voice was calm but hollow, like the words were walking through fog to reach him. Caleb obeyed. He didn't want to, but some part of him understood. Maybe it was the way his father placed a hand on his shoulder before sending him to the tent, firm, lingering, like it might be the last time. Inside, sleep didn't come. He laid still in the dark, staring at the tent's ceiling, listening to the brittle crackle of burning wood outside. The air felt charged, electric, as if the entire forest had stopped breathing, waiting. Hours passed like smoke. The fire dimmed and the shadows thickened. At some point, the crackling stopped altogether. Silence returned. Not natural silence, but a complete, smothering one. Not even crickets. That was when Caleb knew something had changed. And then it happened. Just before dawn, when the black sky began softening to a dull gray, a sound tore through the trees. One scream, singular, piercing, not a cry for help, not a warning. It was something else, something ancient. A scream ripped straight from the core of someone who had reached the very edge of human fear. Caleb sat up instinctively, heart hammering, unable to move, eyes wide in the dark. The scream echoed once, bounced between the trees, and then nothing. No rustling, no movement. Just that horrible silence once again, deeper now. He waited for another sound, for footsteps, for his father's voice to call out. But it never came. He clutched the edge of the sleeping bag, nails digging into the fabric. The sky continued to lighten, slowly washing the tent in dull blue. Caleb stayed frozen, knees pulled to his chest, waiting. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Still no sound, no return. Only the slow rise of morning and the deafening realization that whatever had happened in the forest, he was now alone to face it. When Caleb ran out of the tent, heart pounding so hard it echoed in his ears, the morning light hadn't yet broken through the veil of black sky. The fire that had once cast warm, familiar shadows on the trees was dead, reduced to a scattering of cold ash. The axe his father always kept nearby, leaned against a tree or resting by the fire pit, was gone. The forest felt like it was holding its breath. There were no chirping birds, no rustling leaves, no hint of wind, only silence. Caleb's breath came in quick, uneven bursts as he scanned the perimeter of their camp, calling his father's name softly at first. A few seconds passed. He tried again, louder, then louder still, until his voice cracked and became a scream, bouncing off tree trunks and swallowed by the forest. His feet carried him in circles, around the tent, toward the creek, back past the log where they'd once sat eating trail mix. No footprints, no sign of struggle, no bent grass or blood or discarded gear. Just absence. He shouted again, yelling his father's name into the void. It came out as a plea, not a command, trembling on the edge of panic. The woods gave nothing back. Caleb ran in the direction he thought he heard the scream, but everything looked the same. The same crooked trees, the same undergrowth, the same unmarked paths that seemed to wind forever. He wandered until his legs threatened to give out, then collapsed by a tree, pressing his back against the bark as he tried to calm the cyclone inside him. The hours crawled. Sunlight eventually filtered through the canopy, but it brought no comfort, just exposure. Caleb stumbled back to camp, hoping, desperately, that he'd find his dad waiting for him, annoyed he'd run off. But the campsite remained untouched, frozen in that same eerie stillness. His father's flannel jacket was still hanging from the tent pole. The pot of water on the stones was cool to the touch. The fishing rods leaned silently against the log where they'd left them. Caleb sat down, unsure what to do. Should he follow the creek? Wait? Try to build a signal fire? He'd paid attention during all the survival lessons, but none of them accounted for the ache twisting in his stomach and the raw, bruising weight of fear. By the end of the day, the fear had grown roots. Caleb barely ate, only forcing down a protein bar when the dizziness became too much. That night, he lit a small fire, more out of habit than confidence, and crawled into the tent, pulling his sleeping bag tight to his chest. Sleep never came. Every snap of a twig or hoot of an owl jolted him upright. He thought he saw figures moving between trees, but every time he stared, nothing was there. The flashlight flickered once, then died entirely. He clutched the unlit object in his hand until dawn. The next few days blurred together. He didn't wander far. There was too much uncertainty, too many thoughts whispering at the edge of his reason. Hunger clawed at his stomach, but it was the silence that wore him down most. That, and the question that haunted him every hour: why hadn't his father come back? Caleb clung to the camera bag like a life preserver, refusing to open it. The photos inside were of happier hours, of laughs and lessons, and a father who had always been the strong one. He couldn't bear to see Jonathan's face right now, not when it felt like looking at a ghost. It was 5 days before a rescue team found him. A hiker had spotted smoke and reported it to the nearest ranger station. When the forest rangers reached Caleb's campsite, they found a boy sunken into himself, barely able to speak. He didn't resist when they lifted him into the rescue chopper. He didn't cry when they told him they were taking him home. In fact, he didn't say anything at all. His eyes stayed fixed on the tree line, as if hoping, still, that his father would appear. Back in town, the news of Jonathan's disappearance traveled fast. The community, tightly knit and often slow to act, rallied with urgency. Search teams combed Hollow Creek for weeks, rangers, volunteers, even drones. But despite the vast effort, they found no blood, no clothing, no trace. It was as if Jonathan Carter had vanished into air. Caleb's return stirred hope for answers, but the trauma had shut him down. He rarely spoke more than a sentence. Doctors said it was psychological shock, not uncommon after a traumatic event. Police detectives tried to interview him, but his recollections were scattered. He remembered the scream. He remembered the missing axe. But everything else was a blur of panic and silence. Authorities offered their theories. Some believed a wild animal dragged Jonathan away in the night, though that didn't explain the lack of signs. Others suggested he'd fallen into the river and been swept away. An accident, a misstep, a slip on wet rocks. But those who knew Jonathan dismissed such notions. He'd been a park ranger, a seasoned outdoorsman. Careful, calculated, always aware. It didn't add up. The woods had taken him, but not in any way people understood. Caleb tried to return to normal life. School resumed. Neighbors offered casseroles. Teachers whispered in the halls. But he remained silent, always quiet, always distant. He sat at the edge of class, always near a window. Sometimes he scribbled maps on notebook paper, recreations of Hollow Creek from memory. Other times he'd stare at nothing for hours, holding the old camera bag in his lap but never opening it. Not once. His therapist encouraged him to use the camera again. Reconnecting with those memories could help, they said. But Caleb never did. Something in him feared what the lens might reveal. It wasn't until nearly 4 months later, long after public interest faded and search efforts were called off, that something changed. A hunter from a neighboring town, out scouting in the remote edges of Hollow Creek, stumbled upon something strange wedged between rocks near the riverbank. It was a backpack, weather-worn, partially covered in mud and tangled in roots. Inside, soaked but intact, were some trail mix bars, a soaked flare, and the Nikon camera. The man didn't think much of it until he wiped the dirt off the lens and recognized the family in the first photo, a father and son standing by a creek, holding up their fishing poles like trophies. The hunter turned it over to the authorities, who confirmed the bag belonged to Jonathan Carter. For weeks, no one dared to check the memory card. They weren't sure if it would still work or what they might find on it. When it was finally opened, investigators expected vacation photos, maybe clues of an injury or a fall. What they found, however, would raise more questions than answers and draw Caleb back into a mystery that had haunted him since the scream shattered their last night together. The hunter who found the bag, Mason Caldwell, was a quiet man in his late 50s who lived off the grid and trusted nature more than people. He spent most days alone, moving through the woods like a shadow, his boots never cracking a twig unless he meant to. His cabin sat 12 miles from the nearest road, nestled in the ridge above Castor Creek, where the canopy was so dense sunlight broke through only in narrow threads. Mason preferred it that way. Out here, everything made sense. The trees spoke honestly, the weather gave fair warning, and silence was rarely empty. He found the backpack while tracking deer through a ravine that funneled down into a steep gully. It had been a week since the last storm, but the earth was still soft, and Mason noticed the depression before he saw the bag itself. Half buried under pine needles and washed-out soil, it looked more like debris than a belonging. He almost passed it by. But something made him stop. When he knelt and tugged it free, the fabric was stiff with dirt and dampness, the zippers crusted in rust. He brushed off what he could, opened it slowly, and found the contents had been spared the worst of the weather by some stroke of luck. Inside was a Nikon camera, its surface smeared with mud but the lens intact. A journal, swollen from moisture, its pages warped and stuck together. A pen, an energy bar. A small compass still pointing north. Mason thumbed open the journal carefully, only a few pages in. The ink had bled, but he could just make out the name scrawled at the top of the inner cover. Caleb M. Turner. He froze. The air around him felt colder somehow, thinner. That name hadn't crossed his mind in weeks, but he remembered it instantly. The missing father and son, Jonathan and Caleb Turner. He stood there for a long time, holding the bag as if unsure what to do with it. A part of him wanted to leave it, to let the forest keep its secrets. The story had always felt cursed, wrong in a way that made your stomach twist when you talked about it too long. And yet, the moment felt important, too charged to ignore. By late afternoon, Mason was hiking toward the ranger station, his strides quick but deliberate. He didn't speak much when he arrived, only handed the bag over with a few clipped words, then left before anyone could ask more. Forensics processed the contents with meticulous care. The journal was separated page by page, each sheet laid out to dry in a controlled environment. Most of the writing had dissolved, but some entries remained legible, simple things. Caleb writing about marshmallows over the fire, a note about a funny-shaped rock that looked like a dinosaur tooth, a line scribbled unevenly, "Dad's acting weird again, keeps checking outside." The real focus, however, was the camera. Amazingly, the memory card had survived. Protected by the camera body and the compact interior of the backpack, it was dry and undamaged. When the data was retrieved, investigators expected the usual. Vacation snapshots, maybe the beginning of a video log. What they found instead left the room silent. The first dozen photos were expected. Caleb grinning, holding up a trout nearly as long as his forearm. Jonathan with a thin beard of stubble, squinting against the sun as he crouched by the fire pit. A sunset bleeding orange across the trees. A pair of boots on a moss-covered log. Smiles. Normalcy. Then the tone shifted. The composition of the photos changed. They became less posed, more frantic, shots taken in low light, angles tilted, branches half obscuring the frame. One picture showed Caleb asleep in the tent, zipped up in his sleeping bag, while Jonathan sat outside by the dying fire, looking over his shoulder. Another had been taken from inside the tent, aimed through the open flap toward the woods. It was dark, grainy, but something about it felt wrong. Trees lined the image, blurred by motion, yet at the far left corner, partially obscured by a trunk, was a shape, black, tall, off-center, indistinct. As the images progressed, they grew more disjointed. Jonathan appeared in more of them, but rarely looking at the camera. He seemed to be crouching in many shots, or standing still in ways that suggested he hadn't known he was being photographed. Then came a series taken in quick succession, 30 or 40 photos all within a 2-minute span. The first few were from behind a fallen log, aimed toward an open section of forest. Then came images that seemed to pivot left, right, up into the trees, all blurry, all anxious. One photo stood out among the sequence. Jonathan, crouched low behind the log, looking straight into the lens. Eyes wide, unblinking, sweat glistening across his forehead despite the cool forest air. His lips slightly parted, mid-breath, like he'd just realized something. His pupils seemed dilated. Behind him, though faint, the trees were no longer just trees. There was something back there. A dark figure, tall and thin, positioned at a strange angle, as though leaning or emerging from behind a trunk. The figure's edges were indistinct, its form blurred not by motion, but by something else. As if the camera couldn't quite capture it. The contrast was subtle, enough that you might miss it unless you were looking for it. But once you saw it, it couldn't be unseen. The final image was a close-up. Jonathan's face filled the frame, taken at such proximity that every line, every drop of sweat was visible. He wasn't looking into the lens anymore. His eyes were cast over the photographer's shoulder, widened in absolute terror. His mouth was partially open, but not in a scream. More like he was about to speak, or had just heard something. The frame cut off the top of his head and the sides of his shoulders. The lighting was odd, artificial almost, as if from a flashlight or camera flash, though no other photos showed use of one. And then, nothing. The card contained no videos, no audio files, no further documentation. Just that last photo, and then black. The authorities released no public statement about the contents of the memory card. Only those directly involved in the investigation knew what it contained. Mason Caldwell was never officially informed of the findings, but when a ranger passed by his cabin weeks later, he noticed the hunter had erected a ring of handmade totems around his property. Wooden carvings, rough but precise, facing outward into the woods. People in town still talked about the Turners. Some believed they'd gotten lost and succumbed to the elements. Others spoke in hushed tones about local legends, old folklore buried beneath maps and hiking guides. A few swore they'd seen things in the forest, shapes, silhouettes, watchers, but no one could explain the look in Jonathan's eyes in that final photograph, the kind of look a man gives when he knows he's about to die, not from a bear or a fall or starvation, but from something much worse, something that had found them, and was still out there. The release of the photos to law enforcement reignited the case, sending waves through the small town where Jonathan and Caleb had vanished. The new development pulled the investigation from its stagnant waters, and for the first time in months, the air felt heavy with the weight of questions that were finally being asked again. But despite the fresh burst of interest, progress remained agonizingly slow. Red tape wound around every corner, and departmental pride tangled with every attempt to move forward. Some officers insisted it was all just a trick of the light, a fluke of nature that could be explained away with logic, if only they could find the right words. Others leaned on the idea that the final images were the product of a man's unraveling mind, a father's last moments twisted by paranoia rather than something more sinister. And still, the murmurs of unease persisted, filling the spaces where rational answers were meant to be. As the investigation stuttered forward, Caleb was brought in quietly. His involvement had been kept to a minimum, but now they needed him. He wasn't there for the public release of the photos. the images that had surfaced and stirred emotions across the town. No, Caleb was invited into the shadowy corner where the unedited footage waited. The files that hadn't been shared with the world. Files that only a few trusted hands had dared to touch. The last camera files were the ones that Caleb fixated on. The images had already disturbed him, unsettled him in ways he could barely describe, but it was the video that broke him. As the footage played, Caleb's eyes widened, his throat tightening with the growing sense of dread. Jonathan appeared in the frame, his face pale, his eyes bloodshot, as if sleep had evaded him for days. He leaned in close to the camera, whispering into the lens. The words came out strained, hoarse, trembling with an urgency that Caleb had never known from his father. "If anything happens to me, tell Caleb. I did it to protect him. Don't trust the noise. Don't follow it." The camera tilted slightly as Jonathan paused, his breath catching, as if he were trying to steady himself against the weight of something unseen, something just out of view. Hearing his father's voice again, so real and yet so distant, shattered the wall Caleb had built inside himself. It was like a dam breaking, and everything came flooding through. The grief, the guilt, the confusion, the rage. Caleb's hands trembled, his chest heaving as the tears started to fall, unbidden, overwhelming him. He clung to those few seconds of footage, as if they were all he had left of Jonathan, as if they were a lifeline thrown to him from a place too far to reach. For a moment, it felt like nothing else in the world mattered except the sound of his father's voice. The words meant just for him. It was a fragile thing, that voice, timid, almost fragile, as if Jonathan had known that whatever came next would be the last time he could say those words. But it wasn't just the words that left Caleb trembling. It was the noise. In the background of the video, faint but unmistakable, a low humming sound buzzed beneath Jonathan's breath, a rhythmic pulse that seemed entirely unnatural. It was mechanical in a way that didn't belong to the wilderness. Caleb's mind raced, trying to place the sound. It was unlike anything he had ever heard in the forest, like the hum of an engine, distant, steady, and rhythmic. It wasn't the wind or the rustle of branches. It was something else, something ominous that had lurked behind the silence of the woods. Jonathan's warning was clearer than ever now. Don't trust the noise. Caleb understood now. His father had known somehow that whatever it was in the forest had not only frightened him, but had driven him to the edge of something deeper. What had they heard that night? What had Jonathan been hiding from when he whispered those last words? The questions multiplied as Caleb stared at the screen, eyes glued to the footage. But what haunted him more than the noise was the image of Jonathan himself, crouched low, his eyes wide with fear, as if he were hiding from something or someone. What had driven a seasoned ranger, a man who had spent his life in the woods, to that level of fear? Was it just the noise? Or was it something worse? Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that the answers were just beyond his reach, locked behind layers of mystery he could barely begin to comprehend. Despite the mounting evidence, the department's response was predictably cautious. They had the footage now, the images, the data from the camera, all the proof they needed to reinvigorate the case. But the resistance was palpable. The officers involved in the case were divided, many of them unwilling to entertain the possibility that something otherworldly had played a role in the disappearance. They leaned on their explanations, their comfort zones, paranoia, a trick of the light, a man's last moments clouded by fear. The idea that Jonathan's warnings might have been rooted in something real was too much to bear for most of them. So they pushed the footage aside, filed it away as unverifiable, and allowed the case to stall once again. The department, with its ever-present pride, buried the footage. Caleb saw it happen. He wasn't invited into the decision-making room, but he felt the ripples of it. The footage was labeled unsubstantiated, the noise dismissed as a technical anomaly, and the warning his father had left him was shoved into the same pile of things that couldn't be explained away. They didn't have actionable evidence, they said. No proof of foul play, no proof of anything that could be acted upon. And so, as quickly as it had been reopened, the case began to close again, sealed with bureaucracy and red tape. Caleb knew what that meant. They were letting it go. Again. The frustration boiled in his chest, and he clenched his fists at his sides. He had been here before. He had watched this same story unfold, the authorities circling back to the same explanations, the same tired theories. They had all but written his father off as a man who had gone mad, a victim of his own imagination, and Caleb wasn't sure how much more of it he could endure. He had trusted them once, trusted them to find his father, to seek the truth. But the truth, whatever it was, seemed to slip farther out of his reach with every passing day. His hands trembled as he turned away from the screen, but he knew he couldn't let this go. Not now. Not after hearing Jonathan's voice again. Not after everything he had learned. Whatever had happened in that forest, whatever had been lurking just beyond the trees, Caleb was determined to find out. Even if the department wouldn't help, even if they chose to dismiss it all, Caleb would not rest. The answers, he was certain, lay somewhere in those woods, and he wasn't going to stop until he uncovered them, no matter how deep the silence ran. Caleb couldn't sleep. Each time his eyelids fluttered closed, his father's voice crashed into him like a wave, a constant whisper in the depths of his mind. If anything happens to me, tell Caleb. I did it to protect him. Don't trust the noise. Don't follow it. The words echoed in his ears, bouncing off the walls of his empty room. The quiet of his house felt suffocating, a vacuum where the absence of Jonathan's presence was a weight he couldn't lift. It was as though the world had been reduced to those fleeting seconds of video, those words of warning that burned through him. They were all he had left, all that tethered him to the truth. The more he thought about it, the more impossible it seemed to ignore. But how could he ignore it? How could he let it go when everything inside him screamed that there was more to the story, something darker and deeper that no one had bothered to uncover? The authorities had shut the case down, leaving him to wade through endless documents, images, and reports that seemed like a puzzle missing pieces. He had tried to make sense of it all, but the grief, the frustration, the constant wondering, they clouded his judgment. He could hardly think straight. His thoughts jumbled together in the dark, only one thing clear. He needed to do something. So he did the only thing he knew to do. He spoke up. At first it was tentative, a few words to his therapist, who had long grown used to Caleb's silence. The words came out in fits and starts, choking on the emotion he hadn't known how to express. He told her about the footage, the hum in the background, his father's warning. The therapist nodded, her brow furrowed in concern, but even she struggled to validate Caleb's suspicions. She'd seen too many cases like his, too many grieving souls who searched for answers in places too painful to visit. She told him he was still processing. He needed to grieve. It was hard for her to say anything else when it was clear Caleb wasn't ready to hear it. After that, Caleb's reach grew wider. He contacted journalists, local officials, anyone he could think of who might listen to his story. It was his last-ditch effort, his desperate plea for someone to believe him. But they didn't. The journalists dismissed him as a young man confused by grief, someone who had become lost in the noise of his own pain. Local officials gave him vague reassurances, telling him they would look into it but offering nothing concrete. One forum after another shut down his inquiries with blunt responses, sometimes cruelly mocking his obsession with a conspiracy that, to them, didn't exist. Most of them wrote him off. He was just a kid, they said. He needed to accept the tragedy, move on, and stop dwelling on the past. But Caleb couldn't move on, not while his father's words burned in his ears, not while the truth was still buried beneath layers of silence and denial. And then, just when it seemed like he was about to give up, there was one person who didn't turn him away, one person who listened. Lance Harrow was a name Caleb had barely heard of in the years before everything went dark. A former investigative reporter, Lance had turned to wilderness advocacy after he left the news world. His career had been spent uncovering the darker sides of environmental issues, and he'd covered Jonathan's work as a park ranger years ago. He respected Jonathan, had known him to be a man of integrity, someone who would never let anything compromise his duty to the land. Caleb's raw urgency in his messages, the way he conveyed his father's cryptic warning, piqued something in Lance, a curiosity that wasn't just about closure, but about the truth. The connection was unexpected. Lance had spent years buried in stories of corruption and environmental cover-ups, but this one felt different. There was something in Caleb's voice, something in his determination that spoke to a bigger story than the small-town tragedy of a missing father and son. Lance believed there was more to it, something Caleb wasn't capable of fully understanding yet, but something that could only be uncovered with patience and persistence. Lance agreed to help, though he knew the risks. Caleb's father had unwittingly stumbled onto something much bigger than a hiking accident, and Lance was certain it had something to do with the very land Jonathan had protected for years. Together, they began to sift through everything Jonathan had left behind. They combed over photos, GPS timestamps, and notes from Jonathan's field journal, documents that had once seemed like routine ranger reports but now held new meaning. The further they dug, the more the pieces started to align, each discovery seeming to reinforce Caleb's worst fears. Jonathan had stumbled onto something dangerous in Hollow Creek, something he wasn't meant to find. But it was the old government records that truly sent a chill down their spines. There, hidden away in dusty archives, were references to a restricted energy development contract that had been initiated nearly 2 decades ago. The project was shrouded in vague references, little more than cryptic lines about acoustic field testing and containment monitoring. No one had heard of it, at least, no one who was willing to speak on the record. The details were scarce, and official documents related to the project had long been buried. The trail was cold, but the implications were unmistakable. Something had been tested in those woods, something that Jonathan had unknowingly walked into. Caleb felt a knot tighten in his stomach as they delved deeper into the records. The names, the project details, all the roads that led nowhere. It was as if the whole thing had been scrubbed clean, like someone had gone to great lengths to make sure nothing was left behind. The phone numbers they tracked down for officials tied to the project were all disconnected. The emails went unanswered. Even the names listed on official papers had been erased from public records. It was as if someone had made sure that no trace of the project remained, that the story would die with Jonathan, that the truth would never come to light. And yet, it was all right there, hidden beneath layers of obfuscation and bureaucracy. Caleb's chest tightened with a mix of anger and disbelief. His father had walked into something that no one had wanted to acknowledge, something that was too dangerous for even the most seasoned ranger to handle. The acoustic field testing, the humming noise Jonathan had heard, it wasn't a mistake. It wasn't paranoia. It was something real. And now, Caleb knew he had to uncover it. He had no choice but to keep pushing forward, to keep digging until the answers were laid bare, no matter how many doors were slammed in his face or how many people told him to stop. His father had been right to warn him, don't trust the noise, don't follow it. But now Caleb understood. The noise wasn't just a warning, it was the key to everything, and he wasn't going to stop until he uncovered the truth, no matter where it led. Lance and Caleb returned to Hollow Creek under the cover of dusk, careful not to attract any attention. The sun had long slipped behind the trees, leaving the forest in a dim, shifting twilight. They had no official reason to be here, no approval or support from the authorities, and no equipment other than the most basic tools, printouts of maps, GPS logs, and an old camcorder that Caleb had borrowed from his uncle. He didn't know why he had insisted on going back. Something inside him had shifted after the discovery of the hatch. A silent conviction that he had to see this through, that the answers were here, hidden beneath the surface, waiting for him to uncover them. He couldn't shake the feeling that this time, he wasn't just a boy looking for his father's body. He was a witness, an active participant in a story much larger than he could comprehend. The forest, however, did not feel like it had before. The familiar scent of pine and earth seemed muted, swallowed up by the thickening silence that enveloped them. It was as if the trees themselves were watching, waiting. Caleb could hear the crunch of his boots on the forest floor, but the usual chorus of birds and insects was gone. There was no rustling in the leaves, no calls from the distant wildlife. The stillness felt unnatural, like the forest had been paused in time, holding its breath. It was as if it remembered, as if it knew what had happened here, and what was still unfolding. As they walked deeper into the woods, Caleb kept his eyes fixed on the GPS screen, watching the coordinates that had been marked on his father's camera, the location where the final photo had been taken. Every step brought him closer to something he couldn't yet name, something that gnawed at the edges of his mind. Lance, ever the skeptic, said little, but the tense set of his jaw told Caleb that he, too, felt the weight of the place. There was an urgency now, an unspoken understanding between them that they were on the verge of something important. They came upon the log first, the one Jonathan had crouched behind in that last photograph. Caleb froze for a moment, staring at it as if the very tree had become a monument to his father's final moments. It was weathered and cracked, just as it had appeared in the image, its surface scored with the faint slashes that seemed too deliberate to be random. The same slashes, the same pattern. Caleb's breath caught in his chest. They were standing in the very place his father had stood, in the exact spot where everything had changed. Lance took a few photos, but Caleb barely registered the click of the camera. His mind was elsewhere, fixated on the eerie stillness that hung in the air. He could feel it now, the hum, faint but undeniable, drifting through the trees like a ghostly whisper. It was the same sound Jonathan had mentioned in his video, the noise that had terrified him so much that he had recorded that final message. Caleb had thought it might be some sort of wind, or perhaps a trick of his mind. But now, standing here, he knew it wasn't. This was something real, something alive in the woods. They moved deeper, drawn by the hum, though neither of them spoke of it. Caleb couldn't explain why, but he felt compelled to follow it. There was a pull in the air, a strange gravity that urged him forward, as if the forest itself was guiding him to an answer. It was irrational, impossible even, but there was no doubt in his mind. He had to keep going. Whatever had happened here, whatever his father had uncovered, it had led him to this moment, to this place. And then, just as the trees began to close in around them, they found it. Hidden beneath a thick blanket of ivy and stone, nearly invisible in the fading light, was something that shouldn't have been there. Caleb stopped dead in his tracks, his heart thudding in his chest. It was a rusted hatch, its surface corroded and weathered by years of neglect. It sat at the edge of a dried-up creek bed, partially buried in the earth, with no markings or signs to indicate what it was or why it was there. No name, no numbers, no explanation. Just a set of sealed doors, old and forgotten, bolted shut with iron bars. Caleb stared at it, transfixed, his mind racing to comprehend what he was seeing. Lance was the first to move. He stepped closer, his eyes narrowed as he studied the hatch with an expert gaze. He pulled out his camera, snapping photos quickly, his movements efficient. Caleb didn't speak, unable to tear his gaze from the hatch. Something about it felt wrong. The air around it was thick, as though it had been soaked in something unspeakable for years, waiting to be disturbed. It was the same feeling he had when he first laid eyes on the photo of Jonathan's terrified face, the same visceral sense that something terrible had happened here, something that reached far beyond the disappearance of his father. The hum was louder now, vibrating through the ground beneath them, rising from somewhere deep within the woods. Caleb felt a chill crawl up his spine as he stepped closer, though he didn't know why. He felt as though he were standing on the precipice of something he could not escape, as if everything that had led him to this point had been a slow, inevitable march to this very place. His hand hovered over the hatch, but he didn't touch it. He couldn't. He didn't know what would happen if he did. All he could do was stare at it, and the longer he did, the more he felt a growing dread in his chest. The silence in the air had become suffocating, thick with tension, as if the world were holding its breath. Lance finally lowered his camera, his face set in a grim expression. He looked at Caleb, his eyes full of unspoken understanding. There was no need to say anything. They both knew what this meant. Whatever had happened to Jonathan, whatever had driven him to record that final message, this was part of it. This place, this hatch, whatever was hidden here, it was the key to everything. Caleb didn't have to hear the rest of his father's warning to know that this was where the answers lay. The terror that had gripped Jonathan in the final moments of his life had been born in these woods, from whatever lay beneath that hatch. Caleb could feel it in his bones. He didn't feel like a grieving son anymore. For the first time since Jonathan's disappearance, Caleb felt something else, something heavy and cold but undeniable. He was a witness now, a witness to a truth that had been buried for years, a truth that was just beginning to surface. And whatever it was, whatever had been hidden beneath the earth for so long, Caleb knew one thing for sure: he wasn't leaving without it. Not now. Not after everything he had seen, everything he had heard. The forest had drawn him here for a reason. He wasn't just chasing ghosts anymore. He was hunting the truth, and it would not be denied. Within days of Lance publishing his exposé, Hollow Creek became a name whispered in hushed tones across newsrooms and government offices. The quiet blog post, filled with detailed satellite overlays, historical contracts, and fragments from Jonathan's journal, had gone viral in ways neither Caleb nor Lance could have predicted. It wasn't sensational, it wasn't flashy, but it was undeniable. Caleb had always known that his father's disappearance was no accident, that the forest held secrets beyond the trees and the rustling of the leaves. Lance's research had given those secrets a voice, and now the truth was out there for the world to see. But it wasn't just the readers of the blog that took notice. A whistleblower, someone who identified themselves only as ex-operative, came forward. They were a former employee of a private military subcontractor, a company hired by the government in the late 1990s to conduct a series of secretive acoustic field tests in Hollow Creek. The source's message was clear and chilling. The acoustic testing wasn't some theoretical experiment. It was real. It involved experimental soundwave frequencies designed to disrupt enemy communications, to scramble signals and destabilize military operations. But something had gone horribly wrong. The frequencies, initially intended as a tactical advantage, began to cause unintended effects on those exposed to them: psychological breakdowns, hallucinations, disorientation, paranoia. The very thing that was meant to be a weapon of war had become a weapon against the mind. And it wasn't just the soldiers who suffered. The sound waves began to seep into the environment around the test site. The forest, too, had become a casualty of the experiment. The whistleblower described how the project was quietly buried after the effects became too dangerous to control. The test site was deemed a failure and abandoned. Everyone involved had been sworn to silence, their involvement scrubbed from official records. The knowledge of what had happened in Hollow Creek had been erased, at least that was the intention. But it hadn't stayed buried forever. Not when Caleb, with his father's journals and the tenacity to search for answers, had uncovered the truth. The hum, the noise that had driven Jonathan into a panic. It had been real. Caleb now understood. It wasn't some figment of his father's imagination, some fear born of isolation or grief. It was a lingering remnant of the failed experiment, a sound wave still echoing through the trees, invisible but potent, capable of shattering minds. The photos, the final video, Caleb's relentless pursuit, they had all become undeniable evidence that Hollow Creek was not just a forest. It was a forgotten test site, a place where human minds had been sacrificed for a military experiment that never should have happened. Caleb's father had walked into it, unknowingly, and had stumbled upon the remnants of that failed experiment. Jonathan had likely encountered one of the remaining pockets of the frequency, the hum that no one had thought to contain, the hum that had driven him to the edge of his sanity. Caleb's mind raced as he pieced it all together. His father's final moments were a result of something man-made, something malicious that no one had been held accountable for. The government's response was swift, predictable, and deeply unsatisfying. A public statement was released, carefully worded to dismiss the reality of the situation while offering a neat, controlled version of events. The statement labeled the entire ordeal a tragic misadventure, an accident that had been blown out of proportion by the media. It claimed that the area would be fenced off for safety, and that all precautions would be taken to prevent further incidents. The narrative had been polished, refined, and served up as the official line, but Caleb knew better. He could see through the lie. The government had put up a barrier, a physical one, around the area where Jonathan had last been seen, but it wasn't about safety. It was about containment, containing the truth. No court hearings would be held. No names would be revealed. No one would take responsibility for the destruction left in the wake of their careless experiment. No one would be held accountable for the lives lost, the minds broken, and the families shattered by something that should never have happened in the first place. Caleb had always known that there were forces at play that were far beyond his control, far beyond anything he could have imagined. The truth about Hollow Creek was just the beginning. He had thought that finding his father's body, uncovering the truth of what happened to him, would bring him peace. But instead, It had opened a floodgate. What had been done in the name of science, in the name of war, had left a scar on the land, and on those who had been touched by it. The pain he felt for his father, the anger that simmered deep within him, could no longer be ignored or silenced. He had to speak out, to keep the story alive, to make sure that this wouldn't be buried like everything else. And yet, even as he prepared to push forward, to find some way to make this right, Caleb couldn't shake the weight of the lie they were being fed. The lie that the experiment was over, that the forest was safe, that everything was back under control. Hollow Creek wasn't just a place of loss for Caleb. It was the heart of a much darker truth, a truth that no amount of government spin could erase. The experiments had never truly ended. The sound waves might have faded from the surface, but the ripple effects were still there, still lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next person to stumble upon them. Caleb's resolve hardened. He couldn't stop now. The whistleblower had given him the key, but it was up to him and Lance to turn it. The world needed to know what had happened in that forest, needed to know the truth about what had been done, and what still lingered there, hidden in the silence of the trees. But as the media circus swirled around the exposé, and as the government went through the motions of deflecting blame, Caleb knew that he and Lance were the only ones who would fight to make sure the story didn't die. Because in the end, this wasn't just about finding answers for his father. It was about ensuring that the truth would be heard, no matter how deep it was buried. It was about making sure the silence would not last forever. Months had passed, but the weight of Hollow Creek still hung over Caleb. The memories lingered like shadows, shifting beneath the surface of his daily life, impossible to ignore. It wasn't just the pain of losing his father that plagued him. It was the deeper knowledge of what had been left behind in the forest, the truth that had cost so much. Now, standing at the edge of the creek again, he felt both a sense of finality and a quiet resolve. The quiet, endless hum of the place had long since faded from his ears, but its memory remained. Caleb held the simple wooden plaque tightly in his hand. It had been made by a local craftsman, rough, unfinished, but somehow perfect. The inscription on it was simple: "For those who were never meant to be forgotten." Below it there was just one name: Jonathan Wills. Caleb had never believed in grand gestures or public memorials. There had been enough of that, too many voices shouting into the void. His journey wasn't about vindication, nor was it about ensuring that the world saw him as the one who'd uncovered the truth. It was quieter than that. He simply wanted a place where his father's story wouldn't be swallowed by the noise. Beneath the trees, in the same patch of earth that had once held the rusted hatch, Caleb dug the small hole. He could feel the roughness of the soil against his palms, the familiarity of the land his father had known so well, and he whispered a prayer into the earth. It was one his father had always said before bed, an old prayer that had been passed down through their family, a quiet blessing of protection. For the first time in months, Caleb allowed himself to feel the weight of his grief. He wasn't sure if the prayer was for his father or for himself, but it didn't matter. It was a prayer of peace, and for once, the peace was something Caleb could hold on to. The plaque sat there now, buried beneath the dirt and roots, a small testament to a man who had been forgotten by most, but not by Caleb. He didn't need anyone else to bear witness. There were no cameras, no reporters with pens and notebooks, just Caleb alone in the forest that had taken so much. He stood there for a long while, letting the wind blow through the branches above him, feeling the pulse of the earth beneath his feet. The world moved on, but here, in this quiet corner of the world, the truth had been planted and would never fade. Caleb had found a way to keep moving forward, even as the pain of the past never quite left him. When he returned home, he threw himself into a cause that had been as much for his father as it was for all the others who had been lost in the shadows of government secrets and forgotten promises. The Jonathan Wills Field Initiative was born from that need, a foundation to support children who had lost parents in mysterious or unexplained circumstances, and to advocate for transparency in government-contracted testing zones. Caleb had long known that his father's death had been a result of something far larger, far more dangerous than the official story, but now, through the foundation, he sought to make sure that no child would be left without answers, without hope. It wasn't easy. There were countless meetings with officials who deflected his questions, who tried to silence him. But Caleb knew better now. He had learned how to ask the right questions, how to make his voice heard without it needing to shout. He began giving talks at schools, reaching out to kids who had lost someone the way he had. He answered emails, sat down with parents, and slowly, one voice at a time, he built a network. It wasn't a network born from outrage, but from understanding, from knowing that the truth wasn't always easy to hear, but it had to be heard. And while Caleb had never set out to be a leader or a symbol, he found that his story resonated with others, not because it was tragic, but because it was real. He wasn't the angry young man seeking vengeance. He was a son, still haunted by the sound in the trees, still chasing the truth that had taken his father. But more than that, he was someone who had refused to let the silence swallow him whole. The world began to listen, not because of his pain, but because of his perseverance. Caleb didn't need the world to know everything. He didn't need to expose every secret, every lie. He simply needed to make sure that his father's story didn't end in silence. The small wins, letters of gratitude, children thanking him for helping them find their voice, added up in ways Caleb never expected. But with every message, with every moment of connection, he began to feel the weight of Hollow Creek, not as something that haunted him, but as something that had given him purpose. In the quiet of his heart, Caleb knew that he would never fully understand the depth of what had happened in that forest, nor would he ever erase the scars it had left on him, but he could live with the truth. It wasn't something that needed to scream, to claw its way to the surface. It just needed to be heard. And that, Caleb realized, was enough. He had done the work. He had fought the battles that mattered. And now, his father's story was no longer just his own. It was part of something larger, something that would continue to grow long after the trees of Hollow Creek had shifted and changed. Caleb had given it a place to live, a place where it could never be forgotten,